In a double whammy of sorts for the Indian economy, retail inflation accelerated to 7% in the month of August, while factory output plunged to a 4-month low of 2.4%. Official data released on Monday showed CPI inflation climbed to 7% from 6.71% back in July and 5.3% in August 2021. The inflation rate picked up on the back of a rise in food prices, especially of fruits, vegetables, spices, cereals, wheat, milk and prepared meals, with a higher pace recorded for rural areas than urban areas. In rural areas, inflation stood at 7.15% in August, higher than the inflation in urban areas at 6.72%, with food inflation at 7.6% and 7.55% respectively. Also separately, the Index of Industrial Production, IIP, also moderated to a 4-month low of 2.4% in July, as against a growth of 11.5% a year ago, with tepid growth in manufacturing, mining and electricity. The industrial output contracted from the previous month by 2.75%. So what do these inflationary pressures mean for the Indian economy? The challenge before the RBI now to tame prices, will it impact recovery? All this and much more in perspective today with an illustrious panel of experts joining us on the program today. So let me first begin by introducing our panelists. With me in the studio is Mr. CHSL, Consulting Editor at the Business Standard. Thank you, sir, for your time. Welcome to Sunset TV. And joining us virtually are two special guests again, Mr. R. Gopalan, former Secretary, Financial Services, Ministry of Finance. Mr. Gopalan, thank you for your time. And Mr. Dipankar Sengupta, Professor of Economics, University of Jammu. Mr. Sengupta, thank you once again and welcome to this edition of Perspective. Mr. Gopalan, let me begin with your thoughts first on what is being described as a double whammy of sorts for the Indian economy. Is it worrisome?
Well, it's not a one-off. It's going to be the average level of inflation given as admitted by RBI for the FY23 is 6.7. So this will hover around that kind of a number. Maybe about 6.7 to 7% for this fiscal. And the core inflation, which troubles me much more, is that it is very, very sticky. It's not, going down at all. The last 13, 14 months, it's not going down. So that is creating a bit of a problem in the sense that, there's a price pressure, underlying price pressure, and the economic agents are able to pass on the price pressure to consumers. And this, with the economy, at least now it is okay, but it's going to really, base effects will operate and it's likely to go down at that point in time, with the investments not flowing in, private sector investments not flowing in so much. In what manner the income in the hands of people will get, increased? If it is not, what is going to happen to the growth of the economy? These are areas which are really troubling at this point in time. Added to that is the fact that the informal enterprises which have been badly got destroyed, both after the demonetization as well as finally in the pandemic period. Now they are not looking up, and that is going to lead to some kind of a demand shrinkage which is being felt by consumer goods people in the rural areas. They call it shrinkflation, the name they have coined. Now, in what manner that is going to affect us is going to be one more thing. And with rice and wheat prices, cereal prices going up, of course, the government has taken steps to ensure that there are export brakes on them. But with the availability of them in the internal market, what extent the prices will go is another area which is causing concern for a large number of people who are living on the margins.
Absolutely. So huge.
All in all, not a very healthy scenario, and coupled with the industrial production going down, and also high frequency indicators indicating what they are. There is a possibility that the economy may slow down, and which is in any case, RBI has said that the last 2 quarters the growth will be around 4% thereabouts. So looking at a 7.1 or 7.2% growth at this point in time looks little rosy. Anywhere between 6.5 to 7 may be the ultimate growth rate for FY23.
Okay, Okay, so
And it has
we'll
implications for
discuss,
monetary
Mr.
policy.
Gopalan, about the measures that are being undertaken and, of course, the challenge that the RBI now faces in terms of the balancing act that it has to ensure to tame prices at the same time without impacting recovery. That is something that I'll come back to you. Let me get in Mr. Bhattacharya's perspective on this not being a one-off incident, of course. You know, all this while leading economies were slowing down, India was in a much better position. We recovered faster than anticipated. We were in a much stable economy. But now this inflation trajectory going up. First of all, what have been, according to you, have been the key drivers behind this, rapid pace of inflation trajectory? And the other fact that if we do not tame inflation, what is the kind of impact that it could have on the economy?
I was listening very closely to what Mr. Gopalan was saying and very wise points that he made. Let's put it this way. The last 2 years, instead of looking at inflation, let's look at what's happened to the GDP. In 2008, 1920, the GDP was at a particular place. From there on till now, the GDP actually has grown by just about 3%. Now, that means that the economy hasn't really expanded. Why? Because of the impact of the COVID. It's just 3% growth over 2 years. And at the same time, the money supply in the economy has expanded. RBI had to expand the money supply. Now it's, of course, reducing it. But what's happening is that there's excess liquidity. So essentially, that means that there's far more cash chasing almost the same amount of good. So obviously, inflation will be high. Now, the way to come out of it is if the production levels rise. But the problems that happen is that there are two-level things. First of all is the food inflation, which tends to be seasonal. And to some extent, I would think a food inflation is actually a good idea in a way that it actually gives more purchasing, more terms of trade better to the rural people, because they bring the food on our table. So I really don't think that's a bad idea. Over the last 2 years, it's actually not happened. The point, as Mr. Gopalan was talking about, the core inflation, which is the manufacturing sector, the industrial sectors, broadly speaking, inflation there. Is that becoming something to worry about? There is some worry about because essentially oil prices have been very hard. They've been very highly elevated. So that is contributing. Of course, also the supply side shocks, which we have talked about enormously, which essentially means that in the world order, goods are not moving particularly properly. So all the two together have contributed to a rise in inflation.
Yes.
As the supply side hopefully gets eased up across the world, and that depends on lots of factors, there will be some pressure off there. Also the fact that the oil economy is gradually coming back to lower prices because of weaknesses in USA, the recession, or at least normalization of the inflation, would mean that there would be better news for the Indian economy. So yes, the core sector inflation will possibly not be rising as sharply as it was doing. Now that's about the maximum that we can say at this point, which means that RBI will have to keep on reducing the amount of cash that was there in the economy by essentially raising rates, and simultaneously the government will have to keep on doing what is called an anti-inflationary position, which means that it doesn't, while it have to move on expenditure, it has to ensure that that expenditure is a quality expenditure, which is capital expenditure. That's about where I'll stop right now.
Okay, let me bring in Mr. Sen Gupta's perspective. As inflation continues to rise, it has in fact remained in a position of uncomfortability for several months now. And this data, as we're discussing, is a little worrisome. How do you look at the RBI now, balancing between not impacting recovery at the same time taming inflation? Because if not tamed, we are talking about how it could pose a bigger problem.
Let me start with a point that Shubhamoy raised. He talked about excess liquidity in the economy. So too much money chasing too few goods. I'm afraid I have a point of departure out here. You see, it's not as if that we are suffering from a lack of excess capacity or there's a shortage of capacity. If there was a shortage of capacity, then this excess liquidity argument would make sense. The fact is that industry is slowing down because of slowdown of demand shows that this excess liquidity, in a sense, is not creating the kind of demand that it was creating then. You see, when we went into a slowdown because of these COVID measures, our way of expansion was not fiscal expansion, it was basically credit or supply expansion. It, in a sense, tempered the effects of COVID. Now we have to rethink it. By and large, if you look at inflation in our economy right now, and this is important because it will impact RBI policy, this is by and large something that has been contributed by the external world. High oil prices, shortage of a lot of cereals, and so on and so forth. Now, given the fact the source of inflation is by and large international, not so much domestic, what RBI can do about it is fairly limited. And therefore, if RBI precipitately acts in ways that can happen on the domestic economy can be pretty worrisome. Yes, there is inflation. We have to realistically ask ourselves that given the source of this inflation, can we realistically do anything about it? And my answer is, as of now, the government has certain policy measures. For example, reducing import duties on certain crops, stopping the export of certain crops. These are piecemeal measures. This is something that we'll have to bear. But I think the government should do nothing on its part to slow down growth. Now, part of the slowdown growth, of course, is the headwinds that the rest of the global economy is facing. So our exports, which were taking off, is now in a sense being tempered. But there is every evidence to show that as oil prices ease, then much of the inflationary impact that our economy has been seeing may actually ease. But I think it's vital that when there are certain things you cannot do nothing about, the RBI should not try to do anything about it. Certainly not a contractionary monetary policy.
Okay, since you mentioned that, it is going to have a bearing on the upcoming RBI monetary policy review, Mr. Gopalan, what is the kind of step that we expect the RBI to undertake now in the upcoming review? Also, of course, interest rate hike is perhaps the best option that analysts have pointed out. So if that happens, how much of an increase can we expect?
Okay, I mean, let me borrow from what Sumo and Pankaj mentioned. You see, the fact that, earlier the money supply was higher than the M3. It was much higher than the M3 growth in credit. Now, credit growth is picking up. And I see that, tremendous amount of liquidity has been withdrawn from the system by RBI for a period of time, both through its own processes as well as through the foreign exchange market. When they were selling dollars, they were sucking in rupees inside. So today I am told it's about 1.38 trillion or 1.4 trillion is the amount that is coming to reverse repo every day. That extent from 6 trillion to 1.3 trillion, that's a big drop. So that is working at this point in time. But as far as the inflation is concerned, there are, which the prices of the previous hikes are yet to be fully passed on by the industry or the economic agent to the consumers. So there is an inbuilt inflation pressure existing at this point in time. Second, obviously, is the issue relating to the overall the inflations. Getting entrenched across. Not it is focused on one or two commodities. Maybe cereals this time, vegetables. Maybe other items like the other items. Pulses is another item. But you look at the consumer thing, you'll find that housing, clothing and footwear, personal care, health, education, everywhere the inflation is core inflation. The inflation is still going up. So there is a necessity for RBI to ensure that the real interest rate is not so much kind of negative. So I presume that there will be another about 35 basis points to increase this time. Maybe they will stop at 6% overall repo. At that time, possibly if you look at still if the inflation is likely to be about 6% average, RBI is looking at looking forward in the next 9 months' time, then probably it will be not a negative real rate at all at that point in time. So that will be one way of ensuring that the inflation is taken care of. But at the same time, we should look at how the exchange rate is going to behave. Now, that is another area which can cause you a little bit of worry. But again, if US is not going to raise rates, as Subhamoy mentioned, there is going to be not that much of a raise, then possibly we'll have less of a problem. The next problem, ma'am, I'm looking at is the balance of payment, which is, the CAD going to be around about 3.5-4% likely this year. The question of getting money from our foreign exchange resources to balance the loss in foreign exchange is going to be one area. And to that extent, how the investments are going to flow into the country, FDI. And those are issues which we need to be bothered about as we go along in the economy.
Okay, since we're talking about measures and policies, Mr. Bhattacharjee, what is your guess? 140 basis points is the kind of increase that we've seen during this financial year. So for the upcoming policy review, if an interest rate hike has to happen, how much can the RBI go up to? And the other aspect that, Mr. Sengupta raised was the impact on exports. So in terms of policy measure, we've seen how the government has, put a temporary ban on export of certain items. How does that impact the export sector?
Yeah, Tina, first of all, lots of our audience often do ask that something like an RBI raising rates, how much does it affect what is called the common man?
Absolutely.
Well, actually, it does affect a lot. Today, practically up to almost the lowest income group takes loans, loan apps we have been talking about. When you take a loan, you pay interest. So interest rates actually today, what RBI decides on, affects probably a lot more Indians than probably what a tax rate change by the government does. And I think that's a very important point to remember, that therefore RBI's position on how rates of interest move is very important, and especially for the lower income groups.
Absolutely, and this is something that is going to be keenly watched, whatever happens.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it has much more significance. Now, having said that, what are the options for RBI? The problems that comes along is USA, which has got the dollar reserve, is bent on raising rates. Now, if the USA keeps on raising rates, and if we don't, then the relative attraction of the two currencies turns adverse for the Indian rupee. So RBI will have to a certain extent raise the rates. That is something determined by international developments. So that's, I take on board what Professor Sengupta is saying, but there isn't much option there about raising rates to a certain extent. Does it affect growth? Well, yes, to a certain extent. But it also affects inflationary expectations. RBI runs something called Consumer Expectation Survey, that how much do consumers going ahead expect inflation to be. And numbers are showing that consumers are again expecting inflation to stay. There was a period when consumers were actually not expecting inflation some years ago. Now they're expecting inflation. That's bad. Because when consumers start expecting higher inflation, then they start behaving accordingly and change their behavior. So that's not something that the Indian economy needs. So RBI has to therefore tamp down on inflation. So therefore, again, the answer comes along that the rate of interest has to rise. Now, as Mr. Gopalan was saying, Professor Sengupta was saying, the choices aren't too many. And I take on board whatever both of them are saying in terms of, making the best of what are the possibilities. The advantage that we have is that we are now in a sweet spot as far as growth is concerned. At 6.5 or 7, we are still the fastest growing economy in the world. Now that's saying a lot. It's also a fact that the Indian economy is actually now pulling in foreign investment. That's also saying something very impressive. So therefore, both the RBI as well as the fiscal policy, that's the government of India, are trying to ensure that they don't do too many things to ensure that they rock the boat, which means that try to pull down the inflation, don't let it go out of control, and yet don't put the growth momentum of the economy off. It's a very difficult balancing act. And frankly, one wouldn't want to be in their feet at this minute.
I think that's going forth. That's going to be the biggest challenge.
So that's where it will be, and in this year we shall be. Some of the good things that we have done, for instance, and we should be happy about that is, for instance, we have managed the monsoon without any power breakdown. Now there's not been any shortage created by energy sector, this economy, and that's something remarkable that has happened. that the coal, oil, and everything has more or less behaved in pattern. So that's helped the Indian economy being stable. We haven't had power outages this monsoon. Those are very important things to have ensured that the growth, that the small industries and others are not disturbed. So yes, there are things which is actually showing up good by in terms of the balancing act, but it is going to be a difficult act when the world, frankly speaking, is giving out signals on which we have absolutely no clue. Because here are two countries fighting and creating disturbances, and then there's COVID, and there's supply. I mean, there's some cities shutting down.
And this disruption has been prolonged ever since the pandemic to the Russia-Ukraine war.
And it's way too many things beyond the control of the Indian government, both RBI as well as the Finance Ministry.
Absolutely, and that's where the challenge is, Mr. Sen Gupta. The fact that there aren't too many options, and interest rate hike is something that is going to directly impact the common man. In developed countries, what we are seeing is an interest rate hike directly affects employment. How related is interest rate hike and employment in India and also, in developing economies?
Before I come to that, let me just pick up on a point that Shubhama talked about. It is true that the Fed is raising rates, and since the US economy is denominated in dollars, there is pressure on the RBI also to raise interest rates, otherwise money just leaves. But remember, our interest rate hike does not have to match the Fed hike. For a very good reason. I think it is time to let the rupee depreciate somewhat so that the real effective exchange rate, that is the depreciation minus inflation, gives some comfort to the exporter. Look, it is all fine to say, let us have a stable rupee vis-a-vis the dollar. At a time when inflation is taking place, it means that the exporter, in a sense, exporting firms, costs are rising, but what they're getting for their products is essentially remaining the same. So they need that particular cushion, and that cushion can be provided if RBI, perforce, having to raise rates, takes care not to match the United States rate hike. That's, I think, extremely important. And yes, what Shubhama talked about is extremely important. If we enter into a system where there is an inflation loop of expectations built in, we will be in very serious trouble. Now, does interest rate hike, in a sense, affect employment? I think what is important is the volume of credit. I think volume of credit, is extremely important. Interest rate hikes do matter. But given the fact that we are at a pretty low rate of interest anyway, I think a hike or so, and I have a feeling the interest rate hike will be a signal to the market to say that, look, RBI is worried about price rise, but I do not think this hike will be substantial enough to cause an economic slowdown. So if there are purists among us which are saying, okay, use interest rate policy as your main tool to anchor inflation.
Okay, so no direct correlation between interest rate hike and the labor market in India. But Mr. Bhattacharjee, if I could understand your perspective, for developing economies like India, is it good interest rate hikes and the labor market in the longer term? What do you think is best for a country like ours?
Well, that's something that Mr. Gopalan has been tackling for years in the Finance Ministry. But yes, inflation to a certain extent in a developing economy helps, because what it does is it creates as the incentive for producers, both in goods and services, to expand production of both and to hire more. So it's actually beneficial. But again, everything beneficial is, within limited doses. Left loose, this becomes an addiction. So that's the point. Employment, so therefore it's a tricky thing. The CMI data and the periodic labor force survey data, which the NSO shows, both show very nicely that unemployment rates have come down in urban areas. We have come to almost the same rate as the pre-COVID rates, which is good. And that is where we should be sticking around. Of course, there are the usual problems that the women are not still, in fact, women have gone off more from the employment market. So those are long-term problems. But the immediate problem seems to have been taken care of. The structure of employment has changed. It's now more casual. formal sector employment hasn't expanded. So to that extent, gig economy is actually taking the slack, but frankly, there are those issues that needs to be sorted out. So, so to answer again the point that you said, unemployment is not being hurt by inflation.
So it's completely different from what we've seen a few days ago in the United States. A lot of headlines, about how it is going to directly affect employment in the country. So good to hear that it doesn't, directly affect our employment sector in the country. Mr. Gopalan, I'll take one last question from you on the way ahead. Given the domestic pressures and the kind of global headwinds that we are facing, so far it's been stable and we are on a sweet spot, as Mr. Bhattacharjee put it in the best way. But going forth to deal with such pressures, and especially the inflationary pressures, what is the right way to go ahead? And by when can we expect inflation to come down?
My calculation reveals that, there is going to be, this level of inflation will continue. Next month it is going to be a little higher. Mm-hmm. Then it will come down a little bit. But in the Q2 of 23, there will be a drop because of base effect. But after that, my calculations in the H2 of 23 calendar year, the inflation will be around 5% for the average inflation of 5%. So, if that also tallies with the RBI is looking at about 5.5% inflation for FY23, so that is going to be the way it is going to move forward. But more importantly, because of the headwinds which we face from the international arena, how that is going to help in growth is something, how going to affect growth is something I am a little keeping my fingers crossed. Despite whatever others may say on jobs and income, unless jobs and income really increase, there is going to be no private sector investment coming into the country. And with inflation, the disposable income will also go down. So that will also be a drag on the growth. So we are in for some short-term difficulties.
Absolutely. I think looking at these short-term difficulties, Mr. Gopalan, I think for now all eyes will be on what the RBI does when it meets for the next policy review. And because it directly affects people like you and me, we will of course be interested in knowing how much of an interest rate hike happens, how is it going to impact our pockets, and that is what concerns us largely. And on the long-term impact on the economy is something that we've discussed with all three panelists who've joined us on the program. They've shared how it's not a major concern, but of course a challenge that needs to be dealt in the coming months by the government in terms of the policy measures that it undertakes. So that having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you once again to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Perspective today, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have all three of you on the program today. So that's it from us on this edition of Perspective, viewers. Thank you for your time as well. I'll see you same time tomorrow now with another topic. Until then, you take